Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through the design way, and today we are going to be talking about judgment. When I told CJ that I was going to talk about judgment, he said, oh, it's a very complex chapter, so you have to do it towards the end. Secondly, you have to spend 6 meetups on it, but believe it or not, we are going to cover it in one meetup. Now, the purpose of covering it in one meetup, there is a lot of material in each of these chapters. And as Dennis was saying, you have to go through the chapter multiple times. As Robert pointed out, he's been going through chapters since 1970s. So that's a good, and actually that's a good sign of a good book, which keeps on giving as you go through it multiple times. So what we're going to do is that we're going to go through this chapter. There are going to be several lines which will remain open. We would not be able to cover everything today, but we're going to spiral back. We can bring up any of the issues at later times. Once we have gone through all the chapters, we'll have time to discuss, do reviews and go through it again. All right. And again, I recommend that you go through the chapters in the order in which you would like to go through. But we're going through the chapter Judgment today, and we're going to start with Joe. Joe, go ahead.
So this chapter was very complex, as you had already mentioned. It's the one chapter that I had a lot more questions than I had actually notes at a certain point. I think judgment in and of itself is a pretty complex topic, but the distinguishing between rational judgment and design judgment it's important to do. And I think that that's what's kind of the key to just separate those two and how they work with one another. So the one thing is that the authors talk about how we're often taught to suppress our judgment and how it actually impacts our creativity. And I think that that's really important because many times we're taught to reserve judgment and look at things analytically in an analytic fashion. And that really doesn't allow you to come up with the result that you would want. It doesn't allow you to use your imagination. And it can also result in analysis paralysis because they talk about how you have value paralysis and analysis paralysis, and you're trying to boil the ocean and take in all these information in order to make decisions. That judgment is needed in order to move forward, and this is something that is second nature to us. So we're taught to suppress it. It doesn't make sense where you should be honing it. That's the ultimate objective. So the idea of the core judgment was interesting to me because everything that basically that's what you are as a human being. You're taking in your information, you're taking in your experiences, your knowledge, your belief systems, and you're making decisions based off of that are only known to you. So that really drives all your judgment. The other area that I thought was worth mentioning is the instrumental judgment, where you're basically looking at a set of tools and methods that you would actually use to make decisions. Now, the most important part of this chapter for me, probably isn't for everyone, is with framing. I thought framing was the most important for a lot of different reasons, because when I thought about this in terms of the ultimate particular, and you're taking your desiderata, and you're going from that to your schema, to your particular, to the real, that you're basically understanding the limits and constraints around what it takes to actually create the particular. And that's your aha moment. So that part of it where you're bringing the unconscious into the conscious as well, and they talk about that as well, and then it's the important part of your frame is that you're also iterating in that process when you're creating your particular. So you're going from your schema to your parte from the real to the ideal. And it's also worth mentioning that judgment as far as the book, speaks about is only resides in the real. So, but you're using, and I guess this is more of a question, but you're using the true as the constraints in order to get to your real, to your particular real. So I see that as like kind of critical. The other part was the roles and responsibilities of the both the client and the designer. I do think that this may have been overlooked. Is one part where it was the client is responsible for the purpose, the approach, and the worth of the project. Now that's fine, and then we have 10 things that are listed out as far as judgment are concerned. Framing judgment, as I mentioned, deliberated, offhand judgment, appreciative judgments, default judgments. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all 10, but there's the 10 categories of judgment that the designer is responsible for. But as we've read in previous chapters, we also have to include the end user in this process. And the end user seems to be missing in this process, because we were always supposed to consider the client, the end user, and the designer when we're evaluating a process in and of itself. So I look at judgment in this particular instance, like you step back and when you're framing something, you're getting your priorities, you're defining your boundaries, and you're thinking about the impacts of what your actions are going to be. And then you're looking at the alternatives. And again, this all feeds into creating the ultimate particular. To me, it's the first step between your desiderata and your particular. And so that's where I see judgment is essentially the most important part about it is framing and how it relates from taking something that was desired and making it real, and then how everything else just iterates from there. I hope that was clear. I mean, I usually like to come up with some kind of example, but anyway.
That was good. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be, let me see. Okay, next up is going to be Laurie, followed by Maritza. Laurie.
Okay. My microphone's being weird.
Yes,
can you hear me?
It works very well.
Okay. I really like this chapter. I just enjoyed hearing this discussion of judgment. I've been a structural engineer for 35 years, and it just made me reflect on, just how much judgment goes into my daily work. And I want to read one sentence that really jumped out at me. It says, when design judgments are executed well, they create beauty and evoke the sublime on one hand and commodity on the other. So what this means to me is, beauty, I'm designing highway bridges. They're not necessarily beautiful, but when the process goes smoothly and you don't leave anything out and everything's kind of neat and tidy, there's a certain beauty to that. And when you when you make good judgments, what your work product is a commodity. It's value. It has a meaning and value. And I'll give a quick example. I'll lead a design team and I'll work with a lot of younger engineers. And one thing I know from my judgment is I have to make sure that they are approaching structural modeling correctly. One engineer could put 5,000 pieces in a model, and maybe only 10 are needed. And so I have to really work with them to make sure that the model is appropriate for what we're doing, and then the output's going to be useful. And then that just, when you do that right, it just unleashes a whole bunch of positive effects. People can understand it, you can check it, you can file it in a calculation book, you can explain it to the client. When it's kind of like the Einstein quote, as simple as possible, but not simpler. So anyway, that's my thing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laurie. Next up is going to be Maritza.
Hi. So this chapter, so this actually is among the first chapters that I did read from this book. I started with section 2, when reading, because I wanted to get the fundamentals first. There's a lot, so much in this chapter to unpack. But honestly, I think that's the very brief, the Cliff Notes, one sentence catch-all for what we're learning about here is that the judgment design is one that is done with intention. So we're not, I feel like the entirety of this chapter is giving us the awareness to realize that judgment it doesn't have to be something that is just happening unbeknownst to you or while you're unaware, that it's something you're doing. Whether or not you're aware that you're making judgments, you're making them. So why not try to make them with intent? So I have a little slide here I'm gonna share with you guys. This is actually from it's from a long paper on, it's a spiral model of musical decision making. But I really like it to help explain some of the many judgments explained in this chapter. I'm going to throw it up on the screen here for you guys. All right, are we all seeing this? Okay, so many other aspects of this book have made me think of a spiral in the methodology of designing and the design process. So in my mind, many of the things spoken of move in this way because there's no edges. And to me, you can slide up, you can slide down, and it's iterative. What speaks to me specifically about this spiral is this: intuitive versus deliberate. And in the book, at several points, the distinction is made between judgment and intuition, while paying both their respects in how they have an importance to us. But emphasis is made on the fact that we do need some deliberate judgments. In fact, there exist deliberate judgments already. And Joe was talking about framing. Framing falls in this side. And I love the idea of talking about more procedural because you're going up. As you move from judgments that are unconscious and that are just happening to you, you're sliding towards deliberate judgments. And as they become more automatic, these are the default judgments that were spoken about in this chapter. And he's saying they almost appear to be snap judgments that are made without any thinking. But he's saying, or the authors are telling us, it's not that you're not thinking about it. It's that you're at a level in your designing that you have enough expertise and experience that you can make these quick on-the-fly judgments that are still deliberate, but they have the backing of having done them already. So you have experience. So I see that as we keep spiraling up. And I like it. This shows the forward movement where we're moving up towards expertise, because the best types of judgments are going to be made the closer we get to expertise. And so this is maybe a little bit of a simple model, but to me, I really like seeing it. And you can actually take the time, and if you redraw this, and you can put in all the lines, you can make one level for each of the different design judgment types that they present. You have the default, offhand, appreciative, experience, quality, instrumental, navigational, compositional, connective, and core. And if we change this to core, it makes sense still. So it's explained to us in this chapter that there exist judgments that are they're going to resonate with us very, very strongly in either direction, because they're so deeply embedded into what we believe to be our very selves that it's impossible for a judgment to happen either to us or from us, about us, or around us that doesn't affect us if it's a core style judgment. And that's the last of the 10 types, and you work your way towards them if you're doing so in your design process with intention. And I really like that, especially if we look, so I like stepping away from designing a project thinking and thinking of designing a community or a culture. And I just love this idea that as we're designing a community, we make sure that the last judgment step we're stepping into with intention is attached to our core. And that just, to me, that's beautiful. And imagine if becoming automatic is included in that, so that your every design judgment has a little bit of that core essence. That to me it speaks to what, Lori was just saying, that when you have, even in building a bridge, when all the pieces come out just right, it's a lovely and a beautiful thing. To me, I flip it and I say, I think you're wrong. A bridge can be beautiful if all the pieces fit just right. It's a beautiful thing. Somehow you have hit at the core essence of that design, and it's just right. So I that was a piece that I wanted to share with you guys. I hope the spiral helps some people who are maybe struggling a little bit with all the various types of judgments that were thrown at us, because I just view them all as different points on a spiral. And it's also, some of them we may not be aware of. This chapter invites us to be a little bit more cognizant that they are there, even if we're not thinking about them. And I really just that spoke to me, that aspect of the judgments. One more piece I'm going to say here before I move on is that in this chapter, there is actually a different graph, and it's a figure 8.4 is it's a circle, and then it has lines crisscrossing in every direction, and it also has all of the 10 design judgments. Slight bias, I like the spiral. The spiral just works for me visually better. I love that there's a humility that's kind of where the chapter, towards the end of the chapter, we're asked and invited to remember that neither the clients nor the designer has the blueprint. It's not like, oh, I know these 10 judgments, I'm good to go. I'm going to create beautiful things easy. There's a friendly reminder here that they're judgments. So you have the map, but when you're making the judgment, you don't necessarily have that map in front of you. So to me, it's this whole concept of exercising a muscle. It's the idea of what is taught to somebody who wants to own a gun for self-defense. If you buy a gun and put it in a drawer and never use it, and then you need to use it to defend yourself, the odds of you being able to A, get the gun, B, have it loaded, and C, be able to point it in any direction with any time to provide you with the self-defense that you need are slim to none. The recommended path for a gun owner is to practice, practice, practice. Because what you want to happen when you're in a crisis moment or in a spot where you need to make a judgment, you want the muscle memory to take over. It should be that you don't have to think about snapping and popping. That should be judgment. That should be something that just comes to you because you have set up the muscle memory already when you were not in a crisis mode. So that's what I'm hearing this chapter. This chapter says, practice and practice. Get familiar with all these different types of judgments so that when you're designing, even if you're not thinking about it, your mind is walking you through the paces because it has a memory of that map. And that allows you to move forward with intention, even when you're not stopping and saying to yourself, I have to do this intentionally. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. I want to follow up on your example of the spiral. I see kind of human action as being spiral. I think that that's the best shape I know to describe human action, because we go in circles. We go through, for example, going from intuition to deliberation again and again. But it's not a circle where we are following the same path. Each time we go around, we are a little better off. Mike and I did a meetup on Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin, and he has this concept of making smaller and smaller circles. And what you're doing is that you're going through one of the cycles so that you are developing kind of the muscle memory. You are internalizing some of the things that you're learning so that the next time you do it, it is a little faster, it is a little smoother, it is a little bit more effective. And then you use that to improve it further. So it becomes tighter and tighter and tighter, and you build, and that's what skill is about, being able to learn something deliberately and then make it unconscious, make it, build it into your muscle memory, as you're saying. And the net result of that is a spiral pattern. So wonderfully put. Thank you. So next up is going to be Zheng. I want to say, Zheng, your presentations have been amazing. You've done a fantastic job of helping us recap the chapters. And folks, please go ahead and type ! if you'd like to share what you got from the chapter. So first it's going to be Zheng, and then folks, you can line up to talk about what you got from the chapter. Zheng.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. Oh, I should go to the beginning, sorry. Okay. So
just a second. Can you change the display settings so that it shows the whole slide? It is now showing both the main slide and the next slide.
oh, how do I do that?
At the top, there is display setting.
Oh,
Display
okay.
setting, and choose, maybe you do duplicate.
Okay, that good?
No, unfortunately not. Oh, now it is good. It's good.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Yeah. So this is chapter 8 about judgment. So at the beginning mentioned judgment is essential to design. Wow. I don't know why this blocked my view somehow. It's distinguished a stellar designer from mediocre one. So the judgment is heart of the design wisdom. It's the means and wise action. Wisdom actually is the result. So what make a good judgment? So the judgment enable us to do the right action, make the proper change, which become the design wisdom. Then they compare the judgment versus rational decision and intuition. So the rational decision-making depends solely on the logic and reasoning, which is different from judgment. Judgment is kind of the subconscious mind we mentioned. I think this is kind of the right brain, left brain work together, how the judgment works. That's why it's very experience-based. It's not rational decision making, but based on our previous experience, how we make the previous choice and what the consequence in the complex situation and particular experience, then somehow we accumulate this embodied knowledge to know in a different situation what we do. Maybe somewhere similar. Then it also compares the judgment to intuition. Intuition is something we believe we cannot improve. It's like, but we think judgment can be learned and applied with some kind of method. So good judgment is essential in all different areas: business, law, medicine, politics, art. And I think in general, it's just very important in real life, which is very different from the academic life, which is more not complex. But in real life, everything is so complicated, so you cannot rely solely on rational, basically. Then they studied the history of judgment. In the history, how they studied the judgment. The Emil Kant studied the normative judgment, judgment of fact, judgment of ethic, and aesthetic. Then John Dewey compared two forms of knowledge. One is technical. I see it as book smart. The other one is practical, more like street smart. It's practice with wisdom, rely on judgment. So the street smart is actually what you learned, learned the knowledge based on your experience. That's something embedded in a person. I think it's very similar to the judgment they're talking about here. Then contemporary study is Vickers also studied the capacity to understand and appreciate the situation to differentiate between the background and foreground. This also, later on, they talk about 10 types of judgment. This is one of them, which is very important. Like Laura mentioned, because a lot of time, inexperienced people will not differentiate what's important, what's not, so they bring everything in. But experienced people will know what's important, what can be the background, what can be the foreground, so they can focus on the important things. And then another study by Reto is the judgment of design and planning. So he found out, we believe all the thought is logical, but at the end of the logical thought, actually is often judgment, not by reasoned decision making. We make decision usually is not very rational in the end. They mentioned intuitive judgment is educated guess about what's true about situational context. And also the hunch or snap judgment is an unconscious mental process, make quick decision on simplified information, abstract from complex situation, choose action based on that hunch. So this is quite interesting because I know a lot of very experienced people, they usually they cannot tell how they make judgment. For example, I remember somebody mentioned about people invest in stocks, and they said why he invests in a stock. He said, I just have this feeling. So they can't explain why. Actually, the more experienced people are hard to explain why, but the less experienced people actually can be more rational, explain the process. Because I think the process, just like Sherkan mentioned, when you deliberately form a process, you can understand each step. But once already embodied in your whole body, whole experience, you can't tell the difference. It just like it becomes like intuitive reaction. So judgment is knowing based on knowledge generated under particular unique situation and is reviewed through the action of knower. So judgment cannot be separate from knower, but decision can. That's the difference between the judgment and decision. So they differentiate the separable knowledge, which is more universal and generalized information, which we learn in school, is more general information, but judgment knowledge, which is inseparable from your experience, which deal with ultimate particular situation, which can very hard to teach or even to put in the library. So it's inseparable from the knower. That's why, we need the basic theory of education in school, but it take many years in practice, people can actually apply them, know how to use the general information in the particular situation. This then they focus more on the design judgment. So the even though this judgment seems to be very abstract, it's hard to teach, but they believe the designer can be better with judgment by meditate, learning the process, meditate on their own judgment making during the design process. So then they can make better judgment. They mentioned the skill on competence. Competence can be practiced, mastered as a support. This knowledge itself is not judgment, but it can support your judgment. People with more knowledge, like they have more tools. The tools cannot help you to make things, but the tools can help you to make things better or easier. And the scientific knowledge also, which is separable knowledge, which also support the good judgment to make a better decision making. So the design judgment, to better understand it, to help us to improve our design ability, I think it's very important for designer to reflect on their own judgment making and make improvement, and which is the key to design wisdom. I think that's in every field we all want to improve. You know, I think later on they mentioned about the difference between design judgment versus the other judgment. The difference is unpredictable. So the judgment is opinion or conviction. So because of that, the Western culture doesn't really trust judgment. They think it's not rational, not logical, and they think it's us. And some people think it's kind of like enemy of creativity. But actually, in reality, we make judgment every single day on every single things. So it's so important. It seems it's not right to ignore it instead of understand it better. So we make judgment in real life every single time. But the problem is that without judgment, we will become analysis paralysis or value paralysis because there's too much information, which we deal with, especially in today's world. We have to make judgment to what information to take, what meeting to join, because there's so many Zoom meetings. We have to make a choice. That's our judgment every single day. So the assumption is this comprehensive understanding, the assumption of making how we dealing with reality, we think with comprehensive understanding, with logical, rational thinking, we make a correct action, take particular situation, is objective and biased process. But this is not real. This is oversimplified. In reality, usually we are overwhelmed with complexity and complication of large amount of information, and with very limited time. So we have to simplify and generalize all those information. That's why the judgment is very valuable. It helps us to overcome this paralysis and engage in this challenging life. So we don't overwhelm by all the things going on. We can find the right track for us to deal with the reality. The formal and rational decision-making process, which we think is standardized use in business, government, and all the other things, is actually not possible in the complex dynamic issue, because in the decision making, if you only use rational analysis, you actually create more options. It's a divergent process. But in the decision making, you have to use judgment through this conversion process to bring all this information back to focus, lead to real comprehension, and to deal with the constraint time and limit to make the right decision. So that explains in reality, judgment is so valuable. Only rely on rational thinking, you cannot go anywhere, basically. Then they categorize of different judgment: intellectual, practical, ethical, system, design judgment. And here we are focused on design judgment. So design judgment deal with violation and desiderata. I learned the word, I can't remember again. So basically, design judgment deal with, we pursue something that's not exist. We try to create some desired result. And so it's try to create something new, not existent. Design judgment is very important during this process to make it happen. And then they differentiate between the client judgment and designer's judgment. I found it quite interesting because the client judgment may not choose the design judgment. They may choose a different approach, like scientific approach, economic approach, political religions, all the other approach, which is quite possible in today's, like I deal with architecture. Some client, they don't care about design. All they care is like, I want to build a house. So their approach is maybe more economic approach or scientific approach. I want to build certain area of the house. They don't care about design. So that's actually, they mentioned that the client and designer's judgment, they have to meet and work together. So if the designer work with the client who have different judgment starting point, then maybe they shouldn't even choose the client. That's a very good lesson for me, actually. The design process starts with the client make a judgment. Is it a Rita? Oh, I have to learn it. Set direction for the design process. So they basically create the criteria and the constraints. So make the judgment worse. What is important in this design? So for some people, like, it's very important they have this additional space for their family, additional family member. They need no more bedroom. And the other client, maybe they just want this beautiful house. They can really, enjoy it. They like modern style. So different clients have different own needs for in the Desirita, in their design, beginning of the design, which set the tone for all the following design process. So the judgment awards. So the designer can suggest or influence, educate the client, but they can then make decision for client, because client in the end is people who pay and they get the service. They need to get whatever they want. So designer's judgment start after the client have this their own judgment. The designer can decide if they want to serve the client with the initial client judgment. That's very important lesson to all designers, because especially when we as a small business, we get business, we sometimes we don't want to let it go. So even though it may not be a right fit, it's a very good lesson to understand what the client wants. If you have very different agenda, like some of my clients, all they care about is what cheap to build a house. But like you don't care about quality of space, maybe we are not good fit. So I think it's very important for them to make sure they start with the right design judgment together. This is the initial judgment will be refined and modified during the design process with the designer and the client work together. Because this process is very dynamic and also made between the conscious and subconscious mind, and between the client and the designer. And during this process, designer is supposed to make larger number of judgments than client. This is very critical, because nowadays a lot of people call their designer, but they're not. They're just applicationer. So for example, one of my clients, some of the architects, have this designer, they end up all come to me because they said, oh, I just tell them to design, do this, they just draw it up. So that's not designer, that's drafter, so I don't quite understand why some people want to be an architect if they don't enjoy it. I said, why don't you do computer, make more money? So don't be a designer if you don't enjoy the process. And so then the framing judgment is very important at the beginning of the design, because it's determined, it basically set up the limit. Every design have the limit of time, budget, every other things. You have to set a limit of any design. So the framing judgment is very important at the beginning, and is with limited time and resource, basically create a focal point to decide what to focus on, what to ignore, and set the intention of direction of the whole design process. Then they talking after the framing judgment, there's 10 different types of judgment in the design process. Default, offhand, and default is kind of automatic judgment. Basically, is with all the experience and every other things, you just make that automatically. But it's different from instinct because it can be retrained. Instinct is something is more deep in our genetic, but this default judgment actually is trained. It's more like a habit, I think. And this at higher level of it's kind of body knowledge, a lot of higher level skill without conscious deliberation. So like very good craftsmen, they can do things very easily with all the years of experience. And I also want to compare it to speed rock climbing. Recently, I watched this speed rock climbing. If anybody haven't watched it, check on YouTube. They can climb this wall in 8 seconds. Second. It's crazy, or minute. So they can like running on the wall. So, and every Olympic training, they have the exact same rule. So people train, they just automatically doing that. I think that's kind of like design judgment, default judgment. Then there's appreciative judgment. Basically is what the history mentioned about the background, foreground, to assign different importance between them. Then there's appearance judgment, it's more about the style, what's the style to go with it. Then quality judgment, which different, they mentioned the difference between the quality judgment and appearance. The appearance is style, which will change during the time. The quality is more about the craftsmanship, the quality of the project. I just met with an actual builder yesterday about the new project. I'm very excited because he really care about the quality. He said he have this quality control process for his project. But unfortunately, the quality always relate to money. And most people, without a trained eye, they can tell the difference. Like the wall, there's 4 different level of walls finish. Most people cannot, or 6 level actually, the hotel is 6 level. But most people can tell the difference. So a lot of my clients, they care about money, the cost, but they can tell the difference. I said, you can get the cost for Apple and then appear, but they're different things. So they only see the number, they don't see the difference. I think that's you really need a trained eye to tell the good quality and the mediocre one. And that's a challenge for a lot of people, they can't. Then there's the instrumental judgment, basically what technique, what media to use. And navigation judgment is the whole design process, how to lead through this design process. Then compositional judgment, how to bring all the parts together as a rational whole things. Then there's a connective judgment, how to use the element form of functional assembly. Then behind all those things, there's a core judgment, which is very critical. They mentioned core judgment is kind of the why behind. They said, if you know the why, you will find out how. I believe it's so true because I want to give an offset example because I know a mom who actually studied every single thing about food, ADHD, all this stuff. And because her kids have challenge, and because everybody give you a little bit knowledge on each book, she was able to read all the books, summarize them, find the right approach. I think when you have why, you will know how. So the core value is so critical. And that's what I like about this book, because it's always mentioned something deeper, like we mentioned about the soul and what about you. It's not just about the surface skill. It's all about who we are, as a designer. I think it's very important as a designer and a client to find the match. Some designer, they don't care about the quality, they care about making money. Then they should work with a client who have the same value, because the core value have been important. Same as consultant, I thought with this contract, I'm very excited to work with because we really care about the quality. We want to create something nice, and I was very excited to find each other. I think as a team, consultant, client, everybody, they need to share similar core value to make it work together. So it's the root of our individual presupposition, composition of meaning and value that's formed a long time. This core value is very deep in us. And they mentioned about 4 different things to peek into our core value. Some is our inborn character, some life experience, creative experience, and the experience sublime. So it's something quite interesting. Then after that is mediative judgment. It's kind of final balance and create a whole. With all this other judgment, you have to, in that, you have to make a final judgment to create this result. The meaning of whole, judgment design is crucial aspect of design. And I think every part have to support the overall whole. I think that's also tell the difference between a good designer, a master from a beginner, because I think beginner, when I look at the building in the city, I always, oh, this designed by a very ambitious young designer, because they try to do so many things in this house, which doesn't go together. they really want to do something. Then you see a masterpiece. Everything looks so simple. Every single detail goes so smoothly. You know, oh, this is the masterpiece. You know, they really, every part support the whole. So you can really tell. But I think it's really need training to understand that, to tell the difference. So it's based on rational concept thinking and aesthetic ethical consideration. I put this picture here because I think we can really learn from nature, because nature is so good with how they put things together. It's so beautiful, you know, and how the parts support the whole, like this flower, every single, you know, petal goes together, support this beautiful. I think we can really learn from nature how to make this holistic, you know, aesthetic, holistic feeling, harmony, you know, feeling of harmony. So understand, improve our capacity, competence, skill in making judgment. Design judgment is designer's responsibility. I really believe so. I think in order to improve our environment, because we live not in nature anymore, nature is beautiful in many sense. We live in a man-made world. We have the, as designer, we have the responsibility to make the environment, you know, aesthetically pleasing and, you know, serve the human being. I really, when I went to Switzerland many years ago, I was so touched because every single thing in that city was designed. You know, a curve, a counter, every single detail. I was like, oh my God, this is so good. But in America, unfortunately, people don't care about design that much. I think it's the education and all the other things, and also the money, they dominate so many things. Because we mentioned, if you want to design, lead the process, it's unpredictable. You cannot predict to make so much money. That's why I think the developers don't really rely on that, because they want to make money. So I think that's why designer may not be best developer in the money sense, but they can create better cities. So design informed process of intentional judgment making. So this kind of summarize my understanding of this chapter. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jing. Really appreciate it. I've just always loved your presentations. I want to add one thing about you're talking about good design and, you know, design which is aesthetically pleasing. When I studied the great books, the person who had the best things to say about beauty was Thomas Aquinas. And he says, what is beautiful? And he says there are 3 criteria. One is that anything beautiful has to be a whole. That's first. Second is that its parts have to be in the right proportion. The proportion of the parts has to be the right for the whole. And the third one is that it has to be clear. There has to be a clarity or brightness. So it is really streamlined to do the function of the whole. So those are the 3 criteria that he has about talking about beauty. All right. If it looks like this is a complex chapter and not too many people have had much to say. So what we are going to do is that I'm going to do the breakout rooms for a longer time, maybe about 30 minutes. So you can talk about judgment in a much more interactive way. And when you come back with the best question that you have. We'll collect all the questions, organize all the questions, and then have everybody answer the questions. Okay, so it'll be a lightning round of answers. The people leading the discussions are going to be Joe, Maritza, and Mike in the 3 different rooms. The rules are very simple. Keep on topic, be brief, and speak your mind, but do so courteously. Starting the breakout rooms now. All right. Welcome back. All right, so I hope you guys have good questions. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to put your questions on the table. More the better. And we're going to start with Charlie. Charlie, what's your question?
Okay, the thing that's made this chapter so extremely difficult for me is that I've wanted to combine the prior chapter that we're looking at, being a designer, with this one, in particular with regard to the question of design character. Okay, how does that come in? So how, in what way do you integrate design character with judgment? And I can ask the question, but don't ask me to answer it.
Okay, that's good. Asking of questions is more valuable than answering of questions. So you raised a fantastic question. How is a designer's character related to judgment? Very good. Next up is Joe, followed by Jen. Joe.
So I have a couple of questions, but this one I can't answer. And I feel like it's answered in the chapter, but I look at the graphic 8.1 where it has the conscious and unconscious, and that's what we've talked a lot about that. How does the collective consciousness fit into this? How does that impact our judgments?
How does collective consciousness impact judgment? Very good. Jing.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One is, in our discussion, we talk about, actually David's own experience, and I reflect on that. I was thinking, in the reality, there's such big gap between the technical knowledge, like the academic knowledge, versus the practice knowledge, like the people gain through the practice. And there's such a big gap, and it seems in the current business corporate, they seems to value the technical knowledge more than the experience knowledge. Instead, I see if they work together, they can actually see how that can apply in reality. Instead, they're like mentioned in the training, they just like this academic people training the practical people, they don't see any use of those. Instead, they work together to find a solution that actually can imply those knowledge into practice. Like they mentioned, Another question I have is, I have a hard time to understand all this different judgment. And I think David mentioned, I think it's a very good example. I want to verify. We mentioned all this type of judgment actually it's just like personality. We have 16 personality types. So it's basically different people may intend to use certain type of judgment. So it's not like I use all 10, but some people use this, some people, so we can help us to identify what exactly those judgment they're using. So like personality type help us understand what's personality, where this person come from. I want to verify that. Yeah.
Okay, very good. What's the relationship between types of judgment and personality types? Okay, next up is going to be Ambika, Marco, and Lynn. Ambika.
So I really loved this chapter. I think it flowed beautifully, and it was really, in a way, luminous to me. And I had something come up when we watched Maritza's presentation, which I really loved, because I also resonate greatly with the spiral. And she's looking at different aspects of thinking and judging. And my question was, at some point, the way you see the world and the way you present a point, it becomes integrated. So when are you making a judgment, as in, are you looking at it aesthetically, or are you saying it's critically, it's not going to work, or is it intuitive? Because at some point it becomes like this, I feel. It's a holistic process. It's not like, if I'm going to make this kind of judgment, I'm going to do this. It doesn't work like, at least the way I see it. So that was one that came up. And the other thing that I asked was, when is judgment not a bias, or when is a bias not a judgment?
Okay, very good. Bias not a judgment, and how are different judgments integrated with one another? Next up is going to be Marco, followed by Lynn. Marco.
In designing your life, who is the designer and who's the client?
Oh, wonderful. Designing your life. Who's the designer and client? Wonderful. Next up is Lynn.
Hello, everyone. So in our group, we had a share where someone said, I need time just to sit with it and reflect. And so the question is really, where does reflection fit into this? And what are we doing in reflection? And it might be related to Ambika's comment, but it's what is reflection and what is the value of sitting with something? What is that process really?
Wonderful. Excellent. All right. Fantastic questions. Let's see what we have here. We've got the designer character and how is it related to judgment? Let's start with that one. That's a very fundamental question. So what is the relationship between let's say character and judgment? A good, he's in the chapter on being a designer, he talks about the character. What is the relationship between that and having judgment? If you have answers, go ahead and type exclamation mark. We're going to do a lightning round. Try to keep your answers short so we can get through as many answers per question and as many questions as possible. Joe.
I mean, I think that it's kind of your core judgments. That's the category I see where your character kind of comes into play. And the sense that you have a philosophy, approach, a belief system. And I think that it's really important that you actually know what that is. And so if you do a lot of introspection and you have a philosophical approach to life in general, then that's kind of your character. You have principles that actually you're managing yourself by. So I think that that's kind of really when I think of the categories that we were talking about, that there's always like this belief that you're making, you're making a judgment. You have this, it's based off of a belief system of sorts, which is part of your core judgment. So that's how I see it fitting into the categories.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Maritza.
So I believe that the judgments are the actions, and our character is formed by one's actions. So if one views it in that way, character is what one finds oneself with after having taken the judgments that one has taken. So that's another vote for intentional judgments, because then you end up with a character that is less surprising and closer to what you thought you wanted it to be.
Wonderful. The place where I learned most about connecting ideas like this is when I was studying the Syntopicon, which is part of the great books. And the idea from there that jumps out here, which is a middle term, is wisdom. Like when you say somebody is wise, has a wise character, what does it mean? That they have good judgment. And it's all about, having the right perspective, which is built over a long period of time, that allows you to make a specific concrete decision better than other people. You're trying to take into account far more things, far more long-range things, involving more people. So that's what I would say. Let's see. Charlie.
I just wanted to second what you were just saying. I said I didn't have an answer, but I do have kind of a tentative sort of guess. And it has to do with the ability to see the larger context, okay, and to be flexible in response to that, and so you do have this experience. But if you have this awareness that every event is essentially a unique particular, then you have that ability to be flexible, to respond to what's going on, what's actually going on, rather than some kind of formulaic approach to what you think it should be or whatever. So it's the ability to be presencing, to be present, and that's, to me, is a key aspect of wisdom, is to be able to not let your ego get in the way, to not let your preconceived notions get in the way, but you still have your combined experiences that you have to draw from, but you don't do it in a formulaic way. You do it in a very creative and imaginative way, while at the same time being present with the particular situation you're in. But
Beautiful.
anyway.
Wonderfully put. That is a fantastic point. Basically, it is being alive to the nature of whatever you're dealing with, being present, at the same time bringing to bear all the knowledge that you have in a way, in a living way, in the sense that you're respecting the life of what you're pointing to in that context, and you're doing that by bringing to bear everything that you have learned about life, not in a formulaic way, but actually how things work, and you're using it in that context. Beautifully put. Next up is going to be Ambika, Joe, Laurie, Jeng, and Laura. This is great. Lots of people want to say things about this, about this core issue. Ambika.
So very rightly, we also learn that people don't like being judged, and that becomes problematic when you're teaching a class, because you're not judging, you're really providing feedback for growth. There's a whole different thing. But at the same time, we are so good at judging ourselves so much that people who judge themselves a lot don't end up doing what they want to do. It becomes self-negating. And how do we get over that hump? It's very important to get over it, because you never taste life if you don't.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambika. So folks, the question is, what is the relationship between character and judgment? Joe.
So, I mean, and I should have said this the first time, it's the idea, and you captured it, was the idea of wisdom, because wisdom is applied knowledge, right? So, and that's what we were talking about, is wise action. But within that, you also have a philosophy, right? So you also have a way of taking in the information and applying that. So you have to have actually a framework for actually making the decisions. So you're making conscious decisions. You're actually using your judgment based on a set of axioms. And so it's really kind of, that is the most critical part, because it's kind of circular from that perspective. Yeah, and I should have had that more than anything, because that's the basis of Stoicism, essentially, in a way. If you're looking at wisdom as a cardinal virtue, or anybody that views wisdom as a cardinal virtue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Laurie, followed by Jen. Laurie.
Okay. I really agreed with what Charlie said, and then your comment after, and mine's just kind of a follow on to that. And I think it's the character. You have to have the character that you even want to start on that spiral that Maritza described. And you might not have, a sterling character in every aspect of your life, but if you're in a design profession, say, you would be, when you're at work in this doing your design, that you are, curious, tenacious, and then you reflect back about your previous judgments, and then you're taking in that knowledge. And I think that's really the core of the character. You might be, a lying, cheating, whatever in the rest of your life, but, you have to have that to develop your design judgment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laurie. Next up is Jing, followed by Laura.
Yeah, I think character versus design judgment is like designer versus design. So our character decide how we will make the judgment. So it's kind of us embody the things we know, and then we make the judgment. Then we learn that maybe that also helped to build our character. Like as a designer, we have the designer quality, all the things we learned from the past. Then we design this project. During the design process, we become better designer through this, deliberate thought process. So I think it's kind of like the person and the action.
Wonderful. Very well put. Thank you. Thank you, Zheng. Next up is Laura, Jeff, and Mike. Laura, what do you think is the connection between character and judgment?
I think everything that we've been talking about. I think there's another dimension, though. You're talking about the architect who works by him or herself versus when they're in a firm. They may choose a firm because obviously there's a job opening in a place that they think that they like the work that is done in that firm. And they go in and, they're placed in a position where they're not doing exactly the work that they were hoping for. They're starting at this lower end of the rung where they're kind of doing that boring work that they have to do, that the firm maybe depends on for their bread and butter kind of stuff, so that they can do other things. I mean, there's a whole dynamic that gets thrown in there for the poor architect, So in any case, I think that, those are factors that have to be built in that depending, the character of the architect is very critical at that point, because, they may feel a little bruised by having to do some really boring shopping center kind of mall thing versus, some really cool, Frank Lloyd Wright type of home somewhere in the woods, thing like that. And so, that's building character also, that they can wait, make it through that process. And so I think, I've known a bunch of architects and I've known the way their lives have been, and it's rough, it's not a pretty beginning. That's all I can say.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is going to be Jeff, Mike, Jeff and Mike. Jeff.
I'd hardly wait to hear what Mike has to say. There's so many ways to look at this, but one is possibly considering this as a phrase, character-based judgment. That within character, there are things like, the value of honor, as well as, a real commitment to and devotion to service. And when you kind of combine, honor and service with judgment, it really, I think it enhances the ability of judgment to be wise, even beyond, a simple rational evaluation of whatever you see. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Mike, I have good news for you. I have figured out a way so that you can talk really well. You are the most difficult person that I've had to deal with in the meetups, because you are so amazing in the range of your erudition, the scale of what you know, what you're able to bring to bear on things. But I've always had trouble of how do we make this work in the meetup? Very simple. I have a simplest idea. You always get 1 minute. And I found that shorter the time you have, the better you speak. And you say more in that time. So Mike, 1 minute, go ahead.
Well, thanks for the introduction. And I also should thank Jeff for providing a lead into this. Designed to, I think we've each said the design is a continuum of choosing the best fit between a series of logical, feasible alternatives. Now, chapter 6 talks about measurement, and it also has a section on how to measure things that aren't measurable. And holistic measurement, nonlinear measurement. If you choose between, if you choose an alternative, you've locked out, let's say you go down a path and choose 3 alternatives, the best possible for each one. You may have locked out one that that makes the really best, globally best alternative. You've locked that out.
Mike, your 1 minute is up. So do you want to summarize what you see as the
Well-
connection between character and judgment?
I didn't think my 1 minute is up. I only used 38 seconds.
No,
I got
I'm
a
keeping
timer.
I'm keeping this.
I have a timer too. We need to calibrate our timers. It's like a chess game.
Yes,
that
go ahead.
you really need to think 5 decisions ahead, and you need to have a strategy for globally evaluating these decisions. Now, it depends on where you sit in the process. If you're a contracting officer trying to compare 9 different proposals from different vendors, and you have to score them and you have to defend them to somebody, how you scored them, that's a different procedure than if you're built a building and it collapsed and killed 50 people, how you defend that to circuit court.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. It was 1
Okay.
minute, 30 seconds with, by deducting my
I
interruption.
yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Always graciously accepted. Thank you, sir. Next question is about judgment and integrity of judgment. The book talks about 10 different kinds of judgment, and Ambika asks, what is the theme that holds all these judgments together? Isn't there like one judgment that you have typically about things? Zheng asked about, what judgments you focus on. Is it dependent on personality type? So what is it that holds this, think of the concept of judgment. How do you think of it? Is there a unity to it? And all the differences in the judgment, what is the nature of those differences? So what is the unity and differentiation in judgment? If you would like to talk about that, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Okay, Lynn, go ahead.
Sure, I'll try. I think it's their symmetry overall. Like if they're almost taken together holistically, and in fact, one probably looks at it more as a friction of one aspect, and that might stop you from kind of going forward with what you're feeling is the right answer. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Lynn. Next up is Ambika.
So Shrikant, that was an interestingly worded question. And what comes up for me is maybe in the process, you are also revealing to yourself your own character, parts which you may not be aware of. And in that sense, the spiral is dynamic. And one may play a greater role at one point and another one at another point. So it becomes still integrated about stuff that you didn't know, but now that comes up, and yet it's the same. I don't know if that makes sense. But yeah, this is because you're, again, just working on, your process here. I had to make a very difficult decision on a project that I funded. This was my project. And last minute I had to change it. As somebody said, you're paying for it. But it worked out. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Next question was from Lynn. But what role does reflection play in judgment? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to answer. Jing.
I think reflection is very critical to improve our judgment in general.
Joe.
I look at it as our conscious, our system 2 teaching our system 1. That's how I would actually frame it. If when you're reflecting, you're actually carefully considering and looking at things. Now, I understand that's the rational mind, and we were talking about the whole idea of avoiding the rational mind, but that is reflection. So that is part of, I don't think we're talking about design judgment in that particular instance. I think we're talking more of on a higher level.
Mhm. Thank you. Excellent. Next up is Maritza, Mike, and Charlie. Maritza.
I think it's part of the iterative process within the process. So, in this chapter, we're told that designing is a design. And I don't think you can get there in one step. Since we have a few steps, it's like every time you go around again, it's a reflection of the first time you went around.
Mhm. Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Mike A.
Yeah, Lynn brought that question up in our breakout room. I think reflection is sort of like the lost tool in all of this because of technology and the way things have sped up. There's no time really to reflect and contemplate. I think that's it's like a missing piece. We need more time before you're on to the next, stepping stone. You need to think back more. It's like the lost cog, so to speak.
Wonderful. Charlie.
Yeah, I'd like to repeat an aphorism that I hope isn't too fiery for some ears, but there's an expression that says, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember your original intention was to drain the swamp. And what happens, I think, when people are involved in a project is that you get so involved in the details and everything and the scheduling and all that sort of stuff that if you don't take time to reflect, to stand back and review the process that you've been going through, then you could end up driving off the cliff or something. And so I think that it's kind of like that Frank Sinatra song, doobie doobie doo, do be, and so you got to kind of alternate back and forth between doing and being.
Thank you. Thank you. The best idea that I've seen on this is by Julian Jaynes, called mental space. What happens is that most of the times we are taking in input and you're just reacting to it. It's like input output. Reflection is all about creating a mental space between the input and output. It's kind of things are coming in and things are going out, and you're creating a mental space where you step back and look at what is going on, almost as a separate entity. Your eye is looking at me going by, and you are able to, and when you do that, you're able to do simulations in your head. What if I did this? What if I did that? What would happen if I did that? And what that does is that it allows you to evaluate your potential reactions and to choose between them. So that's the best idea I know on being on reflection or self-reflection. Dave.
Well, I think the old iceberg that 90% of your wisdom, intelligence, and experience is in your subconscious, and you need your subconscious time to bubble up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Ambika.
This is that delightful process called editing, where you become more reflective of what works and what doesn't. And it's very important to be clear at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I think most of the writing is editing, where you are going through this process of writing something and then actually stepping back. I actually prefer to walk away from my writing, have a cup of coffee, or, if it is particularly important, actually take a break and then come back on it, maybe sleep on it if it is a significant one, but at least a small pause where you go and come back to it and look at it as if somebody else wrote it. And then you're able to edit it, and then you can, let it flow again. So going back and forth between that. Next up is Lynn.
Yeah, Shikrant, you just said it. It's we get that detachment so that when we come back, we're able to see more clearly. So yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's see here. Let's take Marco's question. Let's look at designing of our lives. Who's the designer and who is the client? how do you think of all these ideas? Let's broaden the question. Let's look at us designing our lives. Any thoughts about how we can use the ideas in this book on the design of our lives? Jing next.
Yeah, I think the designer is us right now, the current us. The client is the true us, and our spouse, our kids, our parents, our relatives, they all client in some way in our community.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jing. Next up is Charlie, Maritza, and Joe. Charlie.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of be repeating what Jing already said, but yeah, I see the client should be the full context. Okay, so that you are part of it. You are, as a human being, you are part of a context. Okay, you are part of nature. You are part of the whole thing, and so it's a question of choosing how those relationships might best be optimized or something like that. In other words, it's trying to work towards enhancing quality of relationships, because you aren't an island. Okay, a human being exists in relationships to other people. Like in Asia, they don't talk about when they address somebody, they won't say Mary, they'll say Joan's daughter, Joan's mother. Joan's mother, what are you doing? So it's a focus on the importance of relationships, and so when you think about designing my life, it's not really your life, really, strictly speaking. It's everybody's life. It's you're part of, it's like a cell in your body. It's how does a cell design its life? Well, it's part of this. It's part of the whole thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, but anyway, that's way of putting it, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. Next up is Maritza, Joe, Ambika, and Lynn. Maritza.
I view it a little, if I were to be viewing it mathematically, I would look at it as two cones inverted. So it would actually be like two spirals going out from each other with the thinnest point in the middle. And we are both spirals, which means we are both the designer and the client. It just depends on which is our perspective in that moment. I'm gonna leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, one of the most intriguing ideas I've heard on this is Jordan Peterson's idea of future self. You're actually building your future self. That's your client. And what you're doing right now, is that going to be good for the future self, or it's going to be bad for the future self? Next up is going to be Joe, Ambika, and Lynn. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it in the self-authoring kind of program too, is kind of that is your future self is actually makes a lot of sense to me. Ultimately, I look at the client though as being the rest of the world, the rest of the people that you interact with. So I mean, that's how you interact. It's with the rest of humanity. It's not necessarily just about you.
Wonderful. I want to give a plug to the next chapter we are going to study, which actually handles this issue perfectly. And that's the concept of service, where it is both you and the world, because it's not, you are operating as a part of the world, of the society. And it is a question of and, it is you and the community. So I think that concept really does a fantastic job of covering this issue. So that's what is coming up next. So next up is Ambika, followed by Lynn. Ambika.
So very simply, everyone's a part of me and I'm a part of everyone. And what I create is going to affect everyone. So let's make something beautiful instead. And that's how, from generations past to generations in the future, we can be clearing things both sides. both ends of time, right, sitting in the middle. So yeah, we are part of all that we have met.
Thank you. Next up is Lynn.
This will be my last comment because I must go, but I have to share that I had a visceral reaction to this question with the client word, because it felt like a depersonalization of the very process, which was all about, kind of an emergent self choosing at every moment with design, and this idea that you can break it apart and who's the client. So I wanted to register that. Thanks.
Excellent.
And this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. It's time for it's a pleasure, and I look forward to joining you.
Lynn, it was wonderful. Lynn, it was wonderful having you here. So thank you very much. So folks, the next chapter is going to be service. And I think these meetups are going amazingly well. So it's going to be service and then splendor of design. That will complete the second spiral. The third spiral is going to start with becoming a designer, going to imagination and communication, the whole and evil of design. So that's what is coming up. I want to tell you about some incredible meetups that are coming up. We have 3 different classics going in parallel. We have Tao Te Ching, we've got Gospel of John, and we've got the Bhagavad Gita. It's just incredible, what we are getting from that. This weekend, Mark is going to do his final series on digital. What is post-human? He talked about last Sunday or yesterday. Sorry, I do too many meetups. It's difficult to keep track of how many days it has been. But it was yesterday that he talked about AI and humans. And he's going to follow up that with post-human ? And digital. So don't miss that. That's Sundays at 3 p.m. If you missed any of the series, it's there on our YouTube channel, 52 Living Ideas. And I'm going to do a presentation on putting together all the ideas I've been learning. I did a version of that where I took 8 different sets of ideas. It was the OODA loop, Bible, the idea of design way, those 4 things, true, real, ideal, and design, branches of philosophy, Jung's cognitive functions. And I've done a presentation. It's already there on YouTube, so have a look. But I want to build on it, of saying I'm going to take an approach which I've never taken before, and that is to look at kind of what should be. So how do you actually bring all these 4 things together, whether it is Aristotle's 4 causes, McLuhan's tetrads? How do you actually apply it? What principles do you use? Because each of us are strong at some things, weak at some things. We also interact with one another. How do you actually use these 4 things in real life? And I have one very simple idea about that. That's what I'm going to be talking about. And if you want to attend that, I would strongly recommend, if you're not already attended that meetup, to see the previous one, because that's where I've put down all of how I see those 8 fields deal with each of those 4 different phases. And I was astonished that I was able to find a way, the same pattern in Bhagavad Gita, and I will be using that as one of the bases. So it's going to be very exciting. That's going to be at 4:30 on Saturday. So I invite you to be there. And again, thank you very much, everybody. It's just amazing, the level of comments here, the conversation. So thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Good night.